Welcome to another lesson. We'll go ahead and jump right into it today, but the Great War is finally over. It's time to look at peace. And by the way, tomorrow will be the day of the test. It'll be over World War I. It'll be a little bit shorter, so potentially 30 or so questions, but we're looking at how peace was actually created between the powers that existed. So the first thing to point out is who were the important peacemakers? Well, number one, you have Clemenceau. He was for the French. You see, the French had suffered great amounts of casualties as well as disaster, and so we're going to see what their opinion was. The second is going to be Lloyd George of England. The third is going to be Orlando of Italy, and then the fourth is going to be Woodrow Wilson of America. And these four figures dominated the peace conference, specifically Woodrow Wilson with his idea of the League of Nations, or the 14-point plan, which we'll look at here in this video just for a short while.
8 of the 14 points were aimed at resolving specific territorial issues among the countries involved in combat, and securing borders and statehood for Italy, the Turkish part of the Ottoman Empire, Poland, and Austria-Hungary. 5 points covered general principles for a peaceful world: open treaties and agreements, freedom of the seas, free trade, reduction of armaments, and adjustment of colonial claims to land. These were all based on the principles of self-determination, the idea that nations should have the right to govern themselves without interference from other countries. The 14th and most influential point proposed that countries form an alliance to guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of great and small states alike. The 14-point speech reflected a tradition of diplomatic idealism that would come to define Wilson's presidency. But how did that idealism translate into action? Well, most of Wilson's points were never fully realized. But one point in particular would have a big impact on the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I.
Ultimately, each country really was just representing themselves. France and England both wanted what were known as war reparations, which means payment for damages that were caused, which is a pretty obvious thing that you would want. Lives have been lost on both sides. In fact, Germany, really, they weren't allowed to show up. They did show up a little bit, and part of their showing up was just to sign the treaty, and France made sure that there was what was known as the War Guilt Clause in the Treaty of Versailles. And essentially, the War Guilt Clause said, hey, everything that has happened in this war is Germany's fault. Forget what happened within Serbia. Forget what happened with Russia. Forget what happened with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is all Germany's fault. And so they were kind of blaming Germany, and Germany had to accept. They didn't have a choice. If you're like, well, they could just say no, Mr. Dickinson. Well, guess what? They had been beaten in war. In fact, Germany's own army had just deserted itself. The Kaiser of Germany was on an extremely fast downhill. Much of Germany's territory would be taken away, and even though there would be Germans living in that territory, and that's actually going to be one of the things that adds up to Hitler being able to unite that Germany during the 1930s. Italy was after specific land that they wanted. Part of it was under Austro-Hungarian control. Part of it was under German control. England wanted control over the seas. Obviously, what about America? Woodrow Wilson just wanted the 14-point plans. Pretty much everybody acknowledged that this treaty wasn't the greatest treaty, but in Wilson's mind, he said, hey, you know what? As long as the League of Nations gets created, it's fine because we, or the League of Nations, can fix it. But that never happened. So, what did it actually cost Germany? Well, as I mentioned in the earlier part, Germany didn't get a part in the negotiations. Essentially, they just had to sign it. Number two, there was the War Guilt Clause, where Germany would have to take responsibility for the whole war. And then number three, the reparations, both to France and England, as payment for what had happened. But that is nothing compared to what Germany actually lost in form of life, which is what this short video will be about.
The Great War is over. Armistices have been signed and the peace process has begun. But how do you end a war to everyone's satisfaction? Already there are those on both sides who are dissatisfied with the agreement signed. Very dissatisfied. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to an epilogue series special to the Great War. As for the idea of the world now being at peace, whatever it was that followed the armistice of November 11th, 1918, it was not peace. Something on the order of 9.5 million men were dead. Germany had lost 55 men for every hour, 1,330 for every day of the 52 months of the war. 1 in every 50 citizens of the Habsburg Empire had been killed. These numbers do not include the more than 15 million men wounded or the nearly 9 million who had become prisoners of war, nor do they include the numberless millions of civilians who had died in every imaginable way. Whatever else it did, the armistice did not end the killing. Life in Europe had become too deranged, too many things remained unsettled, and too many young men who knew nothing but war found that there was nothing for them to go home to. In armistice terms, Germany will have no offensive capability by land, sea, or air, and the Allies would keep the German colonies. And the naval blockade of Germany would continue until an actual peace treaty could be signed. And with Allied control of the Baltic, the blockade would be even more effective. So the hunger in Germany and Austria would continue. The victors would gain most of the practical advantages of a German surrender and would be strong enough to impose their wishes at the peace conference. The difference between all this and unconditional surrender was one of symbolism and psychology rather than substance. You might think that the armistice with Germany that ended the war in the West was a result of Allied Commander Ferdinand Foch's cleverly converging offensives and German Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff's errors in not pulling back and reconsolidating his forces before it was too late. And that is certainly true to an extent. But in the bigger picture, the German army simply ran out of men. Peter Hart has this to say: war was not a straightforward progression towards success. In truth, the Allies eventually won on the battlefields because of a massive superiority in numbers and resources. It cannot be denied that the performance of the German army was incredible.
At the end of the day, when Woodrow Wilson comes back to America with the treaty, because remember, even though he is the President of the United States, he doesn't get to sign treaties. Instead, it's going to be the Senate that gets to sign treaties, and he presents the treaty to the Senate, and ultimately they say, yeah, you know what, we don't really like this. And then he presents to them the League of Nations, which he has headed, created, whatever you want to say. He's the founder of this, and the Senate looks at this and says, you know what, we just sent millions of men and we had tens of thousands of boys die in Europe. We're just going to let them exist for a while. We're going to focus on ourselves. So they also stay out of the League of Nations, which was a huge defeat to Woodrow Wilson. Now, I don't want to say Woodrow Wilson did a terrible job working on this or that there was necessarily even anything wrong with it, but he worked hard on this. And he worked so hard that he actually cost his health, and he's actually going to die shortly after his presidency. Thanks for watching. That's really all that we have time for today. As I said earlier, we do have the test tomorrow, so hopefully that goes well. Hopefully the quiz that you guys took a little while ago went well. I hope that you guys have a great rest of your day as well as your weekend. You are dismissed.
I don't know if I am glad or sorry to be alive. I only know that it wasn't my fault that I am alive.